it's my pleasure to be here, and my gratitude to the organizers of this conference and the host of this conference. It's especially touching because that's my sort of alma mater. I've done my second undergraduate program here, and then my first graduate program, and now I've been invited here by my teachers, and some of these teachers I consider to be teachers with capital T, here as a colleague. And this is something I am very grateful for. Now, I've prepared a paper, but the paper now I see turns out to be too long, and colleagues in this kind of cases, they say, well, I'll probably just summarize my paper. I'll be just speaking, and then of course they take at least twice as much time as they would take if they read the paper. So I'll maybe try to read it, and when I'll be running out of time, I hope Father will kick me, and then I'll still summarize, and then my apologies for getting you bored, but I promise to compensate on panel discussion later on, and I'll have you fun. So the presentation was supposed to be about the Catholic alternative to the current trials of democracy. And most of my presentation will be about the context of this alternative. And at the end, I'll be briefly trying to speak about the content of the very alternative. And I'm primarily interested in what it is exactly that the alternative should be given to. So I'll touch on the matters discussed at the first panel session and by the speakers before me in this session. So there is a lot of talk about populism these days. And the rhetoric of our talk about populism is rather gloomy. It appears to be common for Western media to associate it with a global, mostly right-wing reactionary movements that endanger liberal political and economic institutions. What's worse, the fusion of populism and religion makes us worry about the hard-won integration of religious traditions into a liberal democratic framework. In my presentation, I would like to problematize this oversimplified interpretation. Drawing on several recent studies in social and political theory, I propose to interpret populism as a symptom of the discontents within liberal political and economic structures. This is, of course, not to say that populist upsurge is unblemished. Populism, especially if conflated with religion, is undoubtedly worrisome. But it doesn't emerge out of nowhere. There are reasons for populism to uprise. And there are reasons for populism to merge with religion. The stability of liberal democracy depends on how those reasons are addressed and what role religion should play in addressing them. Leaving aside much of what should be said on the topic, I would like to raise 5 theses. First, liberalism infringes upon the popular sovereignty of a democracy. Second, liberalism infringes upon the public political involvement of religion. Third, the combination of both of those two infringements brings about the marriage of populism and religion. Fourth, populism linked with religion is an understandable but inadequate reaction against the side effects of liberalism. And fifth, religious traditions have a potential to contribute to the stability of a democratic polity without joining with populist movements. In what follows, I'll try to unpack those five theses. So my first thesis, liberalism infringes upon the popular sovereignty of contemporary democratic political regimes. Let us begin with defining some key terms. By liberalism, I do not mean a liberal polity that respects civil rights. Rather, I mean a project that aims to build up a stable and just society on metaphysically neutral principles. As John Rawls put it, political, not metaphysical, principles should regulate distribution of benefits and burdens in a liberal society. This ideal presupposes that there are neutral reasons sufficient to discuss constitutional essentials and the matters of basic justice. To put it bluntly, the most important political issues should be resolved in a way that does not appeal to any specific moral, religious, or cultural reasons, but to neutral public reasons. Such a thin conception of democratic public sphere is naturally linked to economic liberalism that opens the door for powerful economic structures. Once those structures transcend state borders, they practically cannot be regulated politically. This concerns, interestingly, both transnational business and transnational bodies of economic governance. Think of European Commission. Huge economic power is centralized in the hands of technocratic governors. But the governors do not constitute any form of legitimate government. Whom do they represent? Who controls them? Who elects them? With whom they compete for power? And so there is a situation that Vivian Schmidt calls the policy without politics. This is how liberalism brings about so-called democratic deficit. Such a framework produces massive dissatisfaction. This is for two reasons. For one thing, liberal, or better say neoliberal economic systems produce harsh injustice. But liberal public sphere does not provide a political outlet for legitimate grievances. This is because there is no neutral language sufficient to tackle the painful issues of national or supranational identity, solidarity, migration, borders, dignity of work, and so on. As Michael Sandel has recently put it, I quote, "Any attempt to address such questions, to reimagine the terms of democratic public discourse, faces powerful obstacles. It requires that we rethink a central premise of contemporary liberalism. It requires that we question the idea that the way to a tolerant society is to avoid engaging in substantive moral disargument in politics." End quote. What Sandel proposes is to repoliticize liberal democracies by means of opening public spaces for substantive moral disagreements. Thus, one of the byproducts of political and economic liberalism is a set of social arrangements far from being fair and even less so far from being neutral. These arrangements explicitly favor the college-educated upper class and leave the working class and parts of the middle class frustrated and humiliated. Since current political framework is not able to canalize frustrations and grievances, humiliated citizens turn against the current political framework itself. The logic here is quite simple. If we cannot act within the system, we'll just act against the system. Later on, I'll come back to this. Now I turn to my second thesis. Liberalism infringes upon the public political involvement of religion. Above, I have referred to liberalism's ambition to elaborate political, not metaphysical, ideal of justice. The ambition implies purifying the public sphere of substantial moral disagreements. This, in turn, implies the exclusion of religion from public deliberation. In this presentation, I'll not go any deeper into the theme of religion and liberalism. I only claim that the modern liberal ideal of resolving political issues without appealing to reasons on which people tend to disagree immediately excludes religion. True, liberal political theorists extensively elaborated on the ways to somehow mitigate, to soften this exclusion of religion. But still, the overarching ideal of political discourse by means of reason alone is there. Political theorists more than ordinary citizens in North America and ordinary citizens more than political theorists in Europe still largely embrace this ideal. Richard Rorty famously defended it by blaming religion as a conversation stopper. He says, since religious reasons cannot be falsified and cannot be proven to be wrong, who will argue with them? How can you argue with them? And in this vein, Stephen Macedo ironically stated that if some people feel silenced or marginalized by the requirement of non-religious and non-metaphysical justification of basic liberties, they should grow up. This ideal raises legitimate grievance and frustration on the side of religious citizens. First, because it's unfair in respect to them. Second, because it makes them split their identity as believers and citizens. So today at home I'm a believer, but then when I enter the stage of the parliament, I immediately have to become the secular, the citizen, and that's how I have to split into parts of what I am. Most importantly, third, it's because there is nothing like a single neutral discourse. As Cécile Laborde rightly observed, liberalism itself is a comprehensive doctrine. Liberalism itself is not neutral. So now, this is a very well-known story, and I replicate a part of this story just to make an argument about the conflation of religion and populism. Here I come to my third thesis. The combination of both infringements brings about the merging of populism and religion. Let me reiterate. Liberalism violates popular sovereignty because citizens do not have democratic instruments to undo the side effects of its political and economic applications. Liberalism also violates religious involvement in political deliberation and decision-making. I believe the combination of those two violations leads to a potentially disastrous marriage of religion and populism. Now, the question is, what does it change? Why this kind of genealogy of the marriage between populism and religion is relevant? And this is, I think, because many arguments about populism and religion are made in a way that here is populism and here is religion, and they are very similar. They function in a very similar way, and there are features they supposedly share, and that's because you have religiously colored populism. And I'm not sure that's a good answer, and I'm completely sure that's not a full answer. And the angle I want to bring attention to is why it happens to be the case that religion merges with populism, and not how. So let me start with the definition. What's usually meant by populism is a kind of thin-centered ideology that firstly antagonizes the people and the elite, secondly emphasizes a direct model of popular sovereignty, and thirdly conceptualizes the people as a homogeneous unity. Populist ideology embodies itself in a political mobilization with a charismatic leader who employs simplistic language. Consider the definition. Each element of the definition suggests obvious affinities with the content of familiar religious traditions or the structure of religious institutions. That's the mainstream argument. So this is how the mainstream argument goes, typically. The figure of charismatic leader resembles Messiah, prophet, or martyr. Single monolithic will of the people resembles the univocity of divine will. Simplistic language and anti-elitism resemble simplicity and accessibility of authentic religious message. Most importantly, the whole structure of populist movement resembles the heritage of classical political theology with its distinction between we, the unitary people, and they, the enemy. Drawing on this kind of observation, Philip Gorski claims that opportunistic populist identity politics hijacks religion to help define the friend and the enemy components of the people. In a similar way, Arato and Cohen believe that populism represents secularization of divine authority and replaces monarchical power. Its affinity with symbolic representation and with the logic of embodiment and incarnation entails a modern form of political theology. Religion provides not only divine legitimation of political power, but also appealing reasons to justify us and condemn them. Now, what I would like to draw attention to is not that on certain conditions religion and populism could fit each other. That's granted. But instead it seems to be the case that populism reacts against certain undesired byproducts of liberalism's political and economic ideals, and that also infringe upon religion. So populism exploits religion, and religion takes political power by means of partaking in populist movements. But the upsurge of populism and repoliticization of religion would be very unlikely had the liberal framework been open, more open at least. And this is where the core of the problem is to be sought for. And with that said, I proceed to my fourth thesis. Populism linked with religion is, though understandable, but still inadequate reaction against the side effects of liberalism. I've already explained why the uprise of populism, including populism linked with religion, is understandable. But being understandable does not yet mean being desired. Populism poses threats to both democratic polity and religious institutions. What dangers does populism pose to democracy? First of all, it ignores the internal plurality within civil society. So there is nothing like single will of the people, as populists tend to claim. For this reason, populism must necessarily be exclusive. It must purify the real people, so us, from the alien contaminating element, so those who disagree. Second, populism is at odds with democracy also because of its inevitable clash with constitutional rights of citizens. So at some point it will always be the case that the will of the people will clash with constitutional human rights, and then there is a problem. In other words, populism's revenge against liberalism goes too far, possibly as far as to overthrow democracy and basic human rights. Why populism is dangerous to religion? First of all, as soon as religion conflates with populism, it loses internal coherence and transforms into a sort of ideology. Gorski gives an example of this sort of ideology. So this is what he says: the affinity is not really between Trump and Christianity. It's between Trumpism and Christianism. By Christianism, I mean Christianity as a political identity deprived of ethical content. Trumpism is a Christianist version of political theology. Second, identification of religious institutions with political parties is empirically proven to increase the likelihood of religious believers to go away. The reason for this is that even though liberalism runs religious citizens by depriving them of political voice, it doesn't run religious institutions by depriving them of political power. Attempting to regain political power by religion will not end up with good outcomes. Moreover, speaking of Eastern Europe, chances are that populism will manage to split religion and civil society, the union that managed to withstand communism. Internal fragmentation within religious and civil society units is evident in Poland and Hungary all across Europe. This can easily be proven by looking at the opinion polls that depict the reception of Pope Francis's messages on migration, climate change, and so on. Whom do Catholics trust? And that's something I think we have to ask ourselves. Whom do we trust? Pope Francis, who appeals to basic moral and religious values and try to protect migrants, or maybe Viktor Orban, who builds, I quote, an old-school Christian democracy rooted in European tradition. And there was recently a paper, I think, in New York Times, and then the framing of the sort of polarization between Pope Francis and Viktor Orban was attempted to make. And then there was no last apostolic exhortation on holiness by Pope Francis, and this is where he says something like, welcoming migrants is just as holy as resisting abortion. And then we have Viktor Orban saying that it's better to permit abortion than to welcome migrants. Well, that's what does Catholic mean within this framework? So I come to my fifth thesis: religious traditions have a potential to contribute to a stability of a democratic polity. Now, I'll briefly sketch a few trajectories here. So first way we can contribute is a way that religions are to undertake a sort of self-reflection on internal reasons in support of democratic legitimacy and democratic institutions. Democratic regimes would be far more stable if all religious traditions endorse popular sovereignty. It's crucial for a democratic polity that citizens who lose a vote don't overthrow democratic order. Religious organizations should foster this understanding. Second, religious traditions should cherish citizens' civil virtues. In this respect, I follow Habermas, who argues that even non-religious citizens in a liberal democracy benefit from semantic contents of religious discourses. This is because liberalism's own implicit ethic is hardly sufficient to hold solidarity, common feel of belonging, and productive engagement in public affairs. For that reason, pre-political religious moral sources are of much help. Third, religious traditions should offer a perspective within a framework of engaged pluralism. The sociological fact of growing cultural pluralism requires us to develop morally robust public sphere open to moral disagreements. Active engaged pluralism does not require us to give up our truth claims. On the contrary, it enables us to be enriched by multiple perspectives and share our own perspective. This participation, the participation in this kind of engaged pluralist discourse is perhaps the most essential task of religious traditions in general and Catholic universities in particular. Now I think I should wrap. I still have 2 minutes. Oh, so I don't have legitimate 2 minutes. You give me 2 minutes. Thank you very much. So I'm wrapping up. So just to reiterate, so there are 5 theses. Liberalism suppresses democracy, and it does so illegitimately. Then liberalism also suppresses religion, and it does so illegitimately. And then because of those 2 infringements, there is a risk that religion merges with populism. And because of the illegitimate action of liberalism, this sort of marriage can be understandable, but it's first inadequate and then dangerous. And what should we do? There are many ways. I've sketched 3 particular ways in which we can position ourselves in this contested and dangerous framework. And all 3, I think, boil down to one thing: we have to witness our identity. We should not be afraid to speak in public who we are, what we stand for, and this is something we have a legitimate right to do. Thank you very much, and my again apologies for getting you bored.